Hi guys, welcome to Business Principles. Today we're going to start into a new chapter, Measuring Economic Activity. Our learning targets for this activity, we're going to be describing the common indicators used to measure the strength of an economy, and later on in the chapter we're going to be explaining the 4 stages of a business cycle. So, the strength of the economy can be measured using several indicators. The first one is gross domestic product, or you may hear it referred to as GDP. There's inflation, interest rates, labor, and the stock and bond markets. Now, gross domestic product, or GDP, is the market value of all final products produced in a country for a specified period of time. It's measured in dollars, and it's one of the most closely followed economic indicators. If you watch one of the business channels or you watch the news in the evening, you may hear them refer to GDP or the rate of GDP for the quarter. Normally, it's measured or published like every 3 months or every quarter. And GDP is used by the President and Congress when they're formulating the country's budget. It's used by companies when preparing business plans and sales forecasts, and financial institutions also use GDP as an indicator of economic activity, which will impact interest rates, which we're going to talk about here in just a moment. Now, per capita GDP is the GDP of a nation divided by its population. It shows the amount of economic output for each person in the country. And when per capita GDP is high, there's more economic output per person, and that is a good thing for the country. It shows that the country is profitable. When per capita GDP is low, it may indicate that the economy is suffering. Per capita GDP is one way to measure a country's standard of living. And you know, we all want to increase the standard of living, so that's one of the goals is to have a higher per capita GDP. Now, the way you measure GDP, there's 4 things to look at when you're measuring GDP. The first is consumer spending, and that includes everything people buy for personal use, like food or clothing, cars, medical care, recreation. And when consumer spending is high, economic growth is strong because consumers have confidence in the economy. They have money to spend. So if they have confidence, they're going to be spending more. If consumer spending is low or the confidence falls, then the economy is going to be weak. For example, with our COVID pandemic, we had a lot of consumer spending just stop. So our GDP has fallen. Another way to measure GDP is business spending. And business spending includes all the purchases made for capital goods and constructions, like factories or machines or warehouses. It's a way that businesses invest in themselves. It's also called investment spending. Now, government spending is spending by all the national, state, or local governments. And the government spends on products and services like national defense, police, fire protection, roads, social programs. The government is putting money into the economy. And net exports are a country's exports minus imports. If a country imports more goods and services than it exports, it's spending more on trade than it's earning. So exporting is selling and importing is purchasing. So you want to be selling more than you're purchasing. So your net exports, you want that to be a higher number. So the growth rate of GDP, when the GDP is rising, the economy is doing really well. The economic growth rate shows the amount and direction of the change in GDP for a specified time period, usually the quarter or a year. When GDP is rising, of course, the economy is doing well. And when GDP growth is above average, it indicates a really strong economy. If the GDP falls below average, then it's showing that the economy is weakening. Another one is inflation. That's another way to gauge measuring economic activity. And inflation is the general rise in prices throughout the economy. The most significant effect of inflation is that it reduces the purchasing power of money. And usually the inflation rate is the rate of change in prices calculated on either a monthly, a quarterly, or a yearly basis. Low inflation doesn't cause problems for an economy, and usually that's between 1% and 4%. But high rates of inflation can create economic challenges. For example, high inflation hurts people who live on a fixed income because they have less purchasing power. Higher inflation leads to higher interest rates, which makes borrowing money more expensive. And it also disrupts the financial planning of workers because a lot of times prices will rise faster than the wages. And people get worried when prices are rising because they're afraid they won't be able to buy what they need because it's going to cost too much. Another thing is the interest rate, another gauge of the health of the economy. And interest basically is the cost of borrowing money. An interest rate is the cost of a loan and is expressed as a percent of the amount borrowed. For example, if your interest rate would be 5% and you borrowed $100, you're going to pay back $105 because you have to pay back what you've borrowed plus the interest or the cost of borrowing the money. And borrowers, when we talk about interest rate and we talk about borrowers can be anyone. They can be consumers, they could be businesses, or they can be governments. Lenders include banks or finance companies or private investors. And loans are made in the form of home mortgages or auto loans, student loans, or business loans. And remember when we talked about supply and demand in the last chapter? Well, the interest rate is based on supply and demand. That's how the interest rate rises and falls, because an increase in demand to borrow money would increase interest rates. And a decrease in demand for loans will cause a fall in the interest rates. So usually interest rates will rise when the economy is strong and there's more demand to borrow money because people have confidence in the economy and they want to either go ahead and buy a new car, they want to go ahead and buy a house, businesses want to invest and expand in their businesses. So that's showing a strength of economy and a confidence. Now, on the other hand, when people don't have confidence in the economy, they'll put off the big purchases, like they won't get the car, or they'll put off buying a house for a while, or a business, instead of expanding their business, they may be laying people off, or they're not going to expand in the near future. So when there's less demand to borrow money, interest rates are falling. And another indicator in the strength of the economy is a labor rate. Now, labor rate is measured by the amount of able workers employed over a period of time. You know, when they are actively looking for work and they can't find a job, that's the unemployment rate, because they want to work, they are able to work, but there is no jobs available. So that's an unemployment rate. Now, if they are looking for work, they are able to work, and they are employed, that is the labor rate. And we have to remember that the unemployment rate doesn't automatically rise and fall with changes in the economy. There's a lag time there, because an improving economy will businesses will want to increase their output, or they want to make their investments, perhaps buy a new factory and or increase their factory and hire new workers. So it takes time to do that. So you will see the unemployment rate fall later after the economy starts improving. And the last indicator today we'll talk about is the stock and bond market. The stock market is made up of public businesses in the U.S. Each share of stock represents a share of ownership in the business. And if the economy is doing well, the value of the businesses are increasing, people will want to invest in the business, so people will invest in hopes their investment will increase in value, so the stock market will rise. So when the stock market is rising, it's indicating that the economy is healthy, and as a result, when it falls, then that's an indicator that the economy is suffering.